Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the And God Said podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Kimberly Constant, and I offer this podcast in conjunction with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, where we read and study every single book of the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. You're welcome to sign up for that study if you want more information. It's on my website at kimberlyconstantministries.com. And you can sign up for a weekly newsletter, which you will receive reading plans, discussion questions, and Zoom links to some optional Zoom discussion groups if you're interested. Or you're welcome to just follow along with the podcast and read and study at your own pace. Today's lecture is going to cover both the first and second book of Samuel. They were originally intended to be one unit, and so I like to present them in that way as well. And it allows us to get a full and complete picture of these contrasts that Samuel has set up for us between King Saul and King David, for instance, between his own leadership and that of the wicked sons of Eli, and even Eli's diminished leadership himself. We see a lot of contrast going on. And so being able to look at both books before I do the lecture helps you to understand those contrasts a little bit better. So this will probably be a long one, so settle in. And of course, you can always pause and come back and finish when you can. So let's look at the best and worst of times, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So where we left off with the books of Judges and Ruth, we learned that everything was pretty much a disaster in Israel. The book even says everyone was doing right in their own eyes. Ruth offered us a bit of a bright spot of hope amidst the darkness, and it sure felt like a breath of fresh air, especially considering the modern day times in which we live, where there is so much fighting and just unrest around the world in the very same region that we're reading about in these stories. So it certainly seems as if Israel is headed for its own destruction when we close out the book of Judges. But perhaps there's one thing left to try. And in Judges, they close with the words, "In those days, Israel had no king." Hint, hint, hint. Maybe if we had a king, it seems to be saying things would be better than they were. But first, we need the time of the Judges to come to a close. And so that's where Samuel comes in. And the first story we get in Samuel is of his mother, Hannah. And if you know me and you followed along by now, you know that I'm geeking out over this because women aren't often mentioned in Scripture, especially in the ancient Near East. They didn't often have an important role to play in terms of Israel's leadership. There are some women leaders here and there. Certainly we saw Deborah was a judge. But here we see this ordinary Israelite woman who is actually quite extraordinary when you look at her faith and what she does. So Hannah is the mother of Samuel. And for Samuel, we get this extended backstory. As you might remember, when we looked at the book of Judges, not all of them give us a lot of detail. Some we know more than others. For instance, Samson, we got backstory on him as well. And some, it's just like, and there was this judge, and he drove a knife into some guy's belly, and then there was peace for 40 years. So here we get a lot of information. And we meet Hannah, and her name means grace. Of course it does. Names mean a lot in the Old Testament, so it's always kind of good to look at what these people are named. So she is one of 2 wives, and it's not clear if she's the first or the second wife. I'm thinking perhaps she was the first, and her husband Elkanah took a second wife because Hannah could not have children. That would seem to make sense because he certainly seems to love her a lot. So why would he take a second wife unless for that reason? Or it could be that he was the kinsman redeemer, the go-well of his family. And we learned about that role in reading Ruth. So if you want to know more about that, go to the lecture on Ruth. And so perhaps he had to take this second wife. Whatever the case, it's not a good situation. There's jealousy, there's bad blood between the 2 wives. The second wife is able to have children, Hannah cannot. And so this family, they are faithful to God. They journey every year as they're supposed to the tabernacle at Shiloh to offer sacrifices. And there we see that Hannah offers even her own prayer, and it indicates her deep faith and her deep grief over the fact that she cannot have a child. And it's an amazing story. She makes a vow at the end to dedicate her son as a Nazarite, like Samson. And so Hannah's answered prayer becomes this son. So she's praying. If you remember from the story, the high priest at the time, Eli, comes up to her and he's like, "You must be drunk. Like, you got to get a hold of yourself, woman." I'm paraphrasing, of course. And she says, "I'm not drunk. I'm pouring my heart out to God." Yes, yes, that is what we're supposed to do. She's doing all the right things, and God hears it and receives her prayer. Not Samuel. Eli blesses her, and she ends up being able to conceive. And she names her baby Samuel, which means heard by God. Isn't that amazing? And she says in 1 Samuel 3, verse 27, "I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will be given over to the Lord." Whew, this is such an act of faith and courage, and I don't know that we fully appreciate it until we think of what is going on. She is dedicating this baby she has longed for back to God, which means she is going to, when he is weaned from nursing, bring him to the temple, or actually to the tabernacle, to live with the high priest and the priests and to serve God at the temple. So she would only get to see her son once a year. Can you even imagine? I mean, he was little. She had just weaned him, but she was faithful and she did what she promised. And as we see in her story, God blesses her and she has more children. But we know that she still would have missed and longed for her son Samuel. But also, what a joyful reunion it must have been every year when she got to go and see him. And clearly he adored his mother, because he starts off his story with her story. And there's something to that. So Hannah also gives us a prayer. She becomes a prophetess, really, in her own right, quite powerful in what she has to say. And so I would ask you to, if you didn't, go back and look closely at her prayer. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and it begins with a praise of God. She acknowledges God's attributes. Her prayer is so beautiful. It reads actually like one of the Psalms, even in the way that it's structured. And so she acknowledges that God is the one who gives strength, that God delivers, that God is holy. And she says, "The Lord is a God who knows, and by him deeds are weighed." Yes, she is recognizing that God does see and hear, because he did in her circumstance as well. And then she offers, in the next two verses, several examples of unexpected outcomes, which we know from, if you were able to listen to the Setting the Scene lecture, this is going to be all throughout the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Unexpected outcomes. That's like the huge theme that emerges. So she says, "Warriors' bows are broken, but the weak are armed with strength. Full people go hungry. Hungry people are fed. Barren women have sons," her own story, "and those with many sons pine away." The story, perhaps, of the other wife. And then she goes on to profess that God is at the heart of all of it. So in verses 6 through 9, she indicates that it is God who makes the unexpected happen. Amen, right? God brings death and also makes alive. God brings down to the grave and raises up. God raises the poor from the dust and the needy from the ash heap. This is Job, and has them inherit a throne of honor. And God will guard the righteous and punish the wicked in the place of darkness. So let's just stop for a minute, because those three verses offer a prophetic glimpse into what's going to happen in the unfolding story of the nation of Israel in more recent times, like in the life of Samuel. But also, this points us to Jesus, and this points us to even Jesus' return, when God will judge and judge between the righteous and the wicked. It's amazing. She says God brings death and also brings alive. He brings down to the grave and raises up. Who does that sound like? Jesus. She makes an allusion to Job, and we haven't gotten to the book of Job yet, But when we do, that is the oldest book of the Bible. That's believed to have been the material that was put into some sort of story form first, even before Genesis was written or compiled by Moses. So that's the oldest book. She knew Job's story, and so she puts it into this prayer. He raises the poor from the dust and the needy from the ash heap. This also speaks to Jesus too, because we know, if you know Jesus' story, that he does not come in with a place of honor. I mean, he's a poor man with no place to lay his head, and of course inherits a throne of honor. And she says, guard the righteous and punish the wicked. And that's going to be a theme we see into the book of Revelation, even, where we talk about the final judgment and the new creation that God is going to have. So it's amazing. This prayer is just, it's stunning. And it was written in and around, I mean, she probably uttered these words, in like 1100 BC, something like that. 1,000 years before Jesus came to be. Amazing. I keep saying that word, don't I? I need a better adjective, but it just is. It's incredible. So the conclusion to Hannah's prayer: one does not prevail by might. Those who oppose God will be broken, and God will judge the ends of the earth. The Lord would give strength to his king and exalt the power of the anointed. So a beautiful opening to the time of the kings. The next people we meet, in contrast to the faithful, wonderful, courageous Hannah, are these corrupt priests. So Hannah, who was a woman in the ancient Near East, one of two wives, unable to have children at the start of the story, was, on the lower end of the totem pole of who had agency in this time period. Eli and his sons, Eli's the high priest of Israel. His sons serve under him. He is at the epitome of Israel's leadership. He's at the very top of the totem pole. And yet we see Eli is not faithful and Hannah is. And so their statuses, get reversed. Hannah offering this gorgeous prophecy that speaks into things that haven't even happened yet in our lifetime. And Eli and his sons, we're going to see all this language about how they're blinded and fat and corrupt.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
Sorry, my watch is talking to me. They're blinded, they're fat, they're corrupt. They've grown fat off their greediness and their wickedness, and they are unable to provide any kind of prophetic word. A little bit here and there, maybe from Eli. So it's a startling contrast. So Eli's the head priest. His name means my God. His sons are his assistant priests. We have Hophni, his name means fighter, and Phinehas, who means mouth of brass. Tells you a lot right there. And we read that his sons are scoundrels. That's what it says anyway in the NIV version in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. But that Hebrew word means so much more than scoundrel. It is an intense word. It means wicked, evil, like the worst of the worst. Wow, you think, what are they doing? They're priests. How can this be? Well, we learn that among other things, they're wrongly eating meat from the sacrifices in the wrong place. If that doesn't make sense to you, go back and listen to the lecture on Leviticus or skim through the book of Leviticus, and you will see that there were strict regulations. Yes, the priests were able to eat some of the meat and some of the bread that were brought to sacrifices. God intended it to be that way so that they could be fed, because they weren't able to be farmers. They weren't able to raise animals. They were busy doing the duties of the priesthood. But they had to eat it in certain places, and they could only eat certain portions. And it was very clearly regulated. And they are doing all the wrong things. They're eating the fat, which was always meant to be burned up. God got the fat always, no matter what type of sacrifice. They're putting their fork in and eating the meat before any of it gets given over to God. And we find out they're sleeping with the women at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now, I talked about this as well in this last week's group of lectures when we looked at the book of Judges. There were women, typically there were widows, that served at the tent of meeting. One of those women we think might have been Jephthah's daughter. Remember, he was the judge that offered that rash oath. And his daughter ended up mourning her, that she would never get to marry and have children. It's believed by many scholars that she became a woman at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So maybe that's who they slept with. I don't know. That's just my conjecture, but I think it kind of makes sense. So these are bad, bad guys. Eli's not great either. He's not as completely corrupted as his sons are, but he is certainly not in a good place. For one, he doesn't appropriately punish his sons. Those things that I just said that his kids were doing, they should have been killed for what they were doing, and he doesn't do that. But we do see that he still has some prophecy left in him. He says in 1 Samuel 2:25, if anyone sins against the Lord, he asks, who will intercede for them? That's a prophetic question, and one that points us right to Jesus, because as we know, the only perfect intercessor for our human sins is Jesus Christ. In the same verse we read, his sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. What? You might be thinking. This is 1 Samuel, again, chapter 2, verse 25, if you want to have a look. This is a matter of translation, although I don't want to dampen the effect, because certainly that's what's going to happen. God's going to put these guys to death. But the Hebrew word that's translated for can mean many, many things. Their Hebrew particles have multiple meanings, and the only way to really kind of try to figure out what they're getting at is to look at context. So that all we know is that particle indicates a causal relationship, but there's all sorts of different ways that they could be related to each other. So the gist of what the narrator seems to be saying is the sons didn't listen, and because of that, the Lord desired to kill them. So the other way you could read it is the sons didn't listen because the Lord desired to kill them. Like the Lord wanted to kill them, and so he made the sons not listen. But it's really the other way around. The sons didn't listen. They were bad. They were wicked. They broke the rules of the priesthood. And because of that, God desired to kill them, because that is the punishment that was their due. So just still meant to be very harsh, because what they were doing was really bad. And they knew that the terms of the covenant indicated that if they did these things, the punishment was death. They also were eating the fat and choice meats. I said this, I think, already, from the sacrifices, but it's spelled out for you in 1 Samuel 2, verse 29. So everything bad that you could do. They are just awful, corrupt people. So then we get to the story of Samuel. So in the midst of this awful time for Israel, God raised up one final judge. And Samuel, we're going to see, is not just a judge, but he also becomes a priest and a prophet. And his name, as I said earlier, means heard by God. And so the one whose name means heard by God would himself hear God's call. So 1 Samuel 3 is the story of Samuel's call. It is fantastic. It is such a well-written segment of scripture. And there's all this analogy going on. There's symbolism, who can hear versus who is heard, who can see versus what is seen. There's so much going on. It's just really a literary work of art, in addition to giving us so much information about Samuel. And so it begins with, in those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. So we see that prophetic activity is in decline because the people who were supposed to be prophets are too busy sleeping with women and eating the fat that should have gone to God. So yeah, they're not getting prophetic visions. Meanwhile, we've seen that this woman, Hannah, did indeed get a prophetic word. But we also read in verse 3 of chapter 3 that the lamp of God had not yet gone out. So there's still a bit of hope here. So 3 times God calls while Samuel is sleeping. 3 times Samuel went to Eli, thinking it is Eli calling him. And then Eli finally kind of clues in, oh, maybe it's God. And so he tells Samuel, go back and listen again. And so on the 4th call, Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. That's what his name means. So cool. Anyway, God tells Samuel he would make the ears of everyone tingle. So do you see all this imagery and hearing, and now everyone's ears are going to tingle because prophecy is going to come back to the nation of Israel. He's going to finally punish Eli and his family for their wickedness. And it says God continued to reveal himself to Samuel through his word, and Samuel's word came to all Israel. So the one that means heard by God, hears God, and then becomes the speaker of God's truth to all the ears of Israel. So cool. Just if you're into English, literary, if you were an English major and English teacher, you'll love this chapter. You'll see all kinds of stuff going on here. So the end of Eli's leadership. So Samuel has been this bright spot introduced into the midst of pretty bad leadership for Israel at the time. So we see that the ark gets captured, and this is kind of the final nail in Eli and his son's coffin. So the soldiers of Israel decided on their own to bring the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle and into battle, hoping that it would secure victory for them. And Hophni and Phinehas, instead of saying, no, you can't do this, supported the action. And we find that 30,000 Israelite soldiers died. The ark was captured, and Hophni and Phinehas died. Everything God said was going to happen. People are not allowed to just bring the ark willy-nilly on their own. The ark is the seat of God's presence. He is holy. He is amazing. Just normal people cannot have contact with that and expect to live. And so we see terrible ramifications for this decision. Eli knew that the ark had been taken into battle, presumably did nothing about it, and is just sitting in a chair by the road waiting to hear what happens. He's 98 years old. It's said that he's heavy. They keep talking about that. The reason they're saying that is because he's eating the fat, and he's eating more of the sacrifice than he should. So yes, he has grown large because he is indulging in what belongs to God. And it says that his eyes had failed so that he could not see. And so there's a lot about eyes in Eli's story. And so when his sight has failed completely, he no longer has spiritual sight either. He has lost his way completely. And so he's old, he's heavy, he is shocked when he finds out that his sons have died. He falls over backwards and dies. At the same time, Phinehas' wife, who was pregnant, went into labor. She died just after giving birth, naming her son Ichabod, which means no glory. And in her words, she says, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. Now notice, she doesn't profess, oh, it's my husband's fault because he and his brother and Eli allowed the ark to be taken. It hasn't been captured in the passive sense. Israel has allowed it to be captured by their own wrongfulness, by not following the rules of God. So then the ark causes all sorts of problems, and it's actually kind of a humorous story of what happens to the Philistines who take the ark. So they set it up in the house where they have their false little G god Dagon set up, and he keeps falling over, and at one point he breaks and he has no arms and legs, and it's meant to be humorous because of course it's just a false god. It has no efficacy at all, and there they have the presence of the one true God. God also afflicts all the people in the place where it is taken. They break out in tumors, and they also have an infestation of rats. So notice their response. When they return the ark to Israel, it takes them a little bit to kind of figure it out. But then they say, we need to give this ark back because nothing is going well for us. So they also give God gifts of golden tumors and rats, which I thought was like, wow, yay. A golden tumor, just what I wanted for Christmas. Please send me some. But this is their way of appeasing God. This is how they appeased their own gods. In the ancient Near East, they gave gifts to their gods and goddesses. Clothing, money, food. Of course, none of this could be used because they're not actually real, whereas the one true God of Israel is real. So the clothes go moldy, the food goes bad, the food also goes moldy. No one uses the money. It's useless. but this is how they operate. And so they do the same thing for the God of Israel. And so we see they give the ark back, but the ark also causes problems for the Israelites because they mishandle it. So 70 people in Beth Shemesh, who are the ones that first get the ark, they look into it, and surprise, surprise, they're killed. You cannot look at a holy God if you're just a normal person and live. So it says in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 20, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? Yes, that question. Yes. No one can stand in the presence of a holy God. That's the whole point. That's why they had tabernacle and regulations and rules for the priesthood, because the ark is not just supposed to be treated like an object that you can use to gain favor. The ark is holy, and they are not treating it as such. And so then the ark is taken to Kiriath Jearim, where it remains for 20 years, and it will stay there until King David brings the ark to Jerusalem. So the main events of Samuel's leadership. He's judge, so he is serving as leader, and we see that in Samuel chapter 6. So he did fight battles. One that's called out for us is against the Philistines at Mizpah. And I highlight this because from this comes the story of the Ebenezer. And I love this verse, this story. It's the first sermon I ever preached was about the Ebenezer because it connects to the hymn. Oh my gosh, I just forgot the name of the hymn. How can I forget that? That was my first sermon. Okay, I'll think about it in a minute. I'm putting myself on the spot here. It'll come to me. But he sets up a stone and names it Ebenezer, and that means stone of help. So we've seen that this has become a common practice. We saw it all the way through Joshua as well, where they will set up kind of stone markers for themselves to help them remember what God has done. Come the fount of every blessing. There you go. Getting older is fun, huh? Come the fount of every blessing is a hymn which talks about the Ebenezer stone. And it's just a great story. It's somewhere on my YouTube channel if you ever wanted to listen to it. But the story of that hymn and how that hymn came to be is awesome. And then the story from Samuel is awesome as well. So when Samuel was old, he appointed his sons to be judges, and they were not faithful. They accepted bribes. So they were somewhat like Eli's sons, definitely not following in the faithful Samuel's footsteps. And so the people decide, we don't want you anymore. We want a king. Samuel gets to anoint two of Israel's kings, both Saul and David. He serves as a mentor and advisor to these leaders, and he continued to serve as Israel's priest until he died. And he dies before David officially became king, while David was fleeing from an increasingly unstable Saul. So that happens in 1 Samuel chapter 25. So Samuel oversees this transition to the monarchy, which in an ironic sense also means removal of power from himself. And if you notice in the story, he's very wounded by this. He feels quite rejected. And God says, yeah, guess what? That's how I feel too. Because not only are they rejecting you as their human leader, they're rejecting me as, their true king. And so the people say, give us a king. They confronted Samuel saying, you are old, your sons do not follow your ways. Appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Oh, there's the rub. Israel wants to be like everybody else. They don't have a human king, and everyone else does. And so it's very easy for them to blame all of their problems on that, rather than turn inward and say, maybe the problem is us. Maybe we're not being faithful. We're forgetting that we do have a king. He's just not a visible human king. He's better than that. He's the one true God. He's the creator of the universe. But they forget that, and they just want to look like everybody else. Remember, this is the teenage years of the nation of Israel. And as we know, if you know a teenager, that's a common thing. They want to be fit in. They want to belong. They want to look like others. And the same is true for Israel. So we get this monarchy emerging, and it's different from the theocracy that God intended. So they feel like the monarchy is necessary for survival, but God's going to say, there's risk in this. He's going to say, hey, do you really think you can have a king like your neighbors? Because guess what? Having a centralized government means losing some of your freedom. And he actually has Samuel warn the people of this. Like, make sure you know what you're asking for. So let me read some of this to you. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting around verse 11. And these are God's words spoken through Samuel serving as a prophet here. He says, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders, others to plow the ground, others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So God is warning, and in that warning is prophecy, as we often see with God, where he says, make sure you know what you're asking, because this is what's going to happen. And the people don't listen, as we also see. God prophesizes through his human prophets, and the people will refuse to listen. And that's what happens here as well. And so they choose to have a king. Now, it should be theocracy through monarchy. Monarchy is a human king as the ultimate leader. Theocracy is God as ultimate leader. Theocracy through monarchy is God as ultimate leader, but the king serving as the kind of the intermediary between God and the people. So Israel's king, unlike other kings in the ancient Near East, was not given divine status. Often in the ancient Near East, their highest leader was considered divine. We remember the story of Egypt and the Pharaoh. He thought himself a god. He was indeed the highest god in all of Egypt. Israelite king is never supposed to say that or think that. The king is supposed to be a servant of the people and a servant of God and be an intermediary between the two. So they're still different from the rest of the ancient Near East, but in visible terms, looking more like they fit in because they have this human centralized leader. So Deuteronomy 17 describes some of the attributes of what make a good king. So, Deuteronomy skipping back all the way to the Pentateuch, where we're getting kind of laws and regulations and provisions for things. And Deuteronomy, if you remember from Joshua, gave us provisions for what happened when they went to war. Well, here we have provisions for what makes a good king. And let me summarize it for you. Number one, the person should be chosen by God. They should be a native Israelite. And they should not spend his ambition multiplying horses, wives, or money. All of those were designations of international influence in the ancient world. So horses equals chariots, equals military innovation, military might or strength. The kind of thing that Egypt and the Canaanites had and that Israel didn't have, and what made Israel's victories against those nations so amazing, because God allowed them to be victorious when they didn't have horses and chariots. Wives is equated with forming military alliances. So when a king married, often it was to secure an alliance. It was a small covenant in a way. I'm going to marry the daughter of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and now he won't be able to come attack me because his daughter is my bride, that kind of thing. And of course, money just means money, money then and money now. Always something to be careful with, because you can get so greedy for money that you lose sight of what really matters. So God says he wants a king who relies on him and not these standard instruments of earthly power: horses, wives, money. In other words, military innovation, military alliances, and wealth. That's not what matters. The king has to be the faithful steward, servant of the one true king, which is God. And the king needs to be fully versed in God's law so that he can make sure that the people are upholding the covenant. So the people themselves demand a king, and it's wrong of them to do so because it's going to be another thing that corrupts them. But uh, God God goes forward with it. He allows them to have a king. And if they can be faithful, God will turn it to good. But the big question is if. So the first of Israel's kings is Saul, and Saul's name means asked of God. He comes from a wealthy, prestigious family. This guy is everything you would think about a king. He's wealthy, he's handsome, he's tall, he looks like a king, talks like a king. Now, he professes otherwise. In 1 Samuel 9, 1, he's being humble. Or is he? This is what he says. It says there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, blah, blah, blah. And he had a son named Saul, a handsome young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. So there you go. He comes from a very prestigious family. He's quite handsome. But he's going to say in verse 21, oh, I'm a Benjamite. I'm from the smallest tribe, and my clan's one of the least of the clans. So some people say, oh, he's just being humble. But then some people say, is he really? Because sometimes pride can mask itself as false humility. So something's going on here with Saul. But anyway, from the outside, he is what we would expect. But his spiritual condition, unfortunately, does not reflect his perfect exterior. But nevertheless, God's Spirit comes upon him because God does anoint him. And so he does experience transformation, and he actually begins his reign with promise. He was chosen and anointed. He's filled with the Spirit. Most of the nation is supportive of him, which is not always the case with the kings. And he's surrounded by valiant, brave men who are willing to go into battle for him. And so things go pretty well in the beginning. He does win many victories, but his pride is brewing, which takes me back to that initial question. Is he really humble? I don't think so. I think he's masking his pride. And so his pride causes him to go too far. And at the heart, ultimately, of his failure is pride and ego. And it caused him to take matters into his own hands. So there's a few things that happen. Number one, he doesn't wait for Samuel. So there's this battle at Gilgal with the Philistines. So the Philistines are kind of who they're up against in this part of Scripture. So we've moved from Canaanites to Philistines. And he is waiting for Samuel to come. They want to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings before they go into battle. They're terrified. They are not, they are no match for the Philistines physically, so they know they need the support of God. But Samuel is delayed in coming. And so Saul decides he's going to do it himself. He offers the sacrifices, he offers the burnt offerings. And in response, Samuel prophesied that Saul's kingdom would not endure, meaning he and his progeny would not continue to rule Israel. So this is a prophecy. This isn't judgment delivered just yet, but this is Samuel saying, like, this is the beginning of your downfall. And the result is going to be that you are not going to get to be king anymore. And in fact, none of your children will get to rule either. He, however, does not heed this warning. He goes on. He makes a rash vow at one point that none of his soldiers could eat before he avenged himself on his enemies. And then, guess what? We've seen this. We've seen this with Jephthah and his daughter. And Saul does the same thing. And then it's his son, Jonathan, who unknowingly breaks this vow. He didn't know his dad made this vow. He ate some honey, which brightened him up because I'm sure he was starving. And then he gets mad. When he finds out, he gets mad at his father because he's like, why would you make this vow? Your soldiers need to eat. They're starving. How do you expect them to hang in there and be strong and brave when they're starving to death? So rightly gets mad, and the soldiers rise up and say, we're not going to let you murder him, because that was the punishment. And Saul says, all right, I'll do it. And they say, no, we're going to protect Jonathan because it's not fair. He did not know. Saul also failed to destroy the king of the Amalekites in another battle. He kept the best of everything for himself while destroying the weakest people, animals, and things. This is against what God has said in Deuteronomy. And this action causes God to pipe in with the words, I regret that I made Saul king. He says that in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 11. And the Hebrew word for regret there means like deep sorrow. Like, this has caused me grief that I made Saul king. And then Saul keeps going. He sets up a monument to himself at Carmel. No, no. And then he tries to wipe out the Gibeonites. Why is that bad? Remember who the Gibeonites are from Joshua's story. They are the group of people who took it upon themselves to to deceive Joshua and make it seem like they were coming from some far off place so that Joshua would create a peace treaty with them because they did not want to be destroyed with the rest of the Canaanites. And when Joshua found out that they had lied, he honored the treaty, and the Gibeonites became like their woodcutters and water carriers. They became, servants, slaves, if you will, to Israel, but their lives were spared. Well, Saul, in his zeal, decides that he just needs to wipe them out because, they lied way back when to Joshua, and they shouldn't have done that. And God is going to get very mad because at this point, the Gibeonites are Israelites, and Saul can't do that. So all of these failures lead God to pronounce judgment. And this happens in 1 Samuel chapters 22 and 23. And in response to the judgment where God says, all right, that's it. I'm removing my hand of blessing from you. Saul does ask for forgiveness, but who does he ask for forgiveness from? Samuel. It doesn't seem that he asked it from God at all. He does worship God. He does finally put to death the Amalekite king, which he was supposed to do from the beginning, but by that point it's too late. He had already lost the blessing. He lost Samuel too. And we read in 1 Samuel 15 that Samuel never visited Saul again. So this man who was his friend and mentor and guide, he loses him. He loses God, and he loses God's representative. It's very awful and sad, but what he deserved because, Saul he never got the message and he never made things right. And so we read that this hand of blessing gets removed. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 16:14 that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. So what does this mean? If you have your Bible, you can kind of look at this. And I know I'm going out of order a little bit, kind of back and forth of what's happening here, but it's all speaking to the same punishments that God has handed down. Just remember, in this part of the Bible, their history isn't chronological. A lot of times they move things around to kind of fit a theme, or they interject stories into the midst of an unfolding story. So it can make it seem like things are out of order. Because, God pronounces judgment in chapter 22 and 23, but the Spirit of the Lord is said to depart from Saul in chapter 16. So that's why it's a little bit muddled in terms of chronology. So what is happening? Why would God send an evil spirit to torment Saul? Well, just know that here the Hebrew is muddled. The verb is passive intense. So that indicates that God removed his hand of protection and an evil spirit took root. Not that God is actively sending an evil spirit, because God doesn't do that. God is not the author of evil, but he did allow it to happen. He removed that anointing, removed the blessing, and then everything that was true of Saul became even worse, because when the hand of blessing is removed, it creates a vacuum into which evil can take root. And we're actually going to see this talked about even in the New Testament as well. So that's what's happening. That anointing's removed, the hand of blessing's removed, and the evil, the little bits of it that were part of Saul, the pride, the ego, the sin, it's just going to get worse. And a spirit is going to take root in him, and he is going to go mad, literally insane from this happening. All right, so I am going to pause here because if I go too long, it's going to cut me off anyway. And then I will start with part 2 where we look at King David. So I'll be right back with part 2. And also, this can be your chance to take a bathroom break, take a Netflix break, whatever you need, and come back for the second half of this lecture.